Hello then, good afternoon and welcome to our L24 special coverage of the China-US escalated tension over Taiwan. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi departed Taiwan on Wednesday after a whirlwind two-day trip that included a meeting with Taiwan's president and vows to preserve democracy in Taiwan in the face of the growing threats from the mainland China. Mrs. Pelosi, the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit self-ruled island in quarter century, now heads to South Korea and Japan before returning to the U.S. During her meeting with Taiwan's president, Mrs. Pelosi said that U.S. wouldn't abandon its commitment to Taiwan, framing her visit as part of broader struggle of a democracy future. On the other side, Chinese officials, including the leader Xi Jinping, in a phone call with President Biden, who warned against Mrs. Pelosi's visit to Taiwan following her arrival in Taipei. Beijing revealed it is preparing a live-fire military exercises this week in areas encircling the island. Earlier on Tuesday, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Hao accused the U.S. on reckless disregard and said it would be held accountable and pay the price for hurting China's sovereignty and security interests. In London, the Chinese ambassador voiced his opposition, warning that those who play with fire will get burned, echoing the threats by China's President Xi Jinping to Joe Biden last week during their fifth phone call. To this end, multiple questions come to the scene. What is the main goal behind the U.S. visit to Taiwan? How China will deal with the visit after delivering a strong threat but the other side didn't pay attention to? Is the Asian continent on the brink of another box war between China and U.S. allies in the region? To answer all these questions, I'm joined live by Mr. Gregory Simons, a situated professor and a researcher at University of Uppsala from Sweden, and also Mr. Manuel Puchelet, geopolitical analyst from France. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, we start with the visit of U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who left Taiwan earlier today after a visit that angered China, which warned several times of taking harsh countermeasures against this trip.
Let's just put it in perspective. Over 4 decades ago, the Taiwan Relations Act was built in building a strong bond between our two countries, advancing our shared interests of governance, economy, and security, while respecting the One China policy.
Military exercises are unnecessary responses. Taiwan has always been open to constructive dialogue, and we will work with stakeholders to bring about stability and peace in the region.
Mr. Simons, I'll be starting with you now. Pelosi and U.S. insisted to make this visit to Taiwan, whatever happens, although China has repeatedly warned U.S. officials to avoid interference in Taiwan. So, what is your interpretation about this visit of a top U.S. official?
Well, it never bodes well for the country being concerned, because if we remember, there were similar visits to Ukraine, and of course, Taiwanese people, because there are protests in Taiwan against Pelosi's visit, need to look to Taiwan and see what happens when a country is turned into an object rather than a subject of international relations at a time when the United States is declining global power. This is an attempt by the US to try provoke and contain China by using a similar strategy as it was attempting to use on Russia with Ukraine.
Perfect, quite understood. Coming to Mr. Puchelet, how can you explain the threats and the strong statements from China over this visit, what they are trying to represent, and in which side U.S. visits to Taiwan is considered as an interference to China's sovereignty?
Yes, I think that today the visit of Mrs. Pelosi is a symbol given by the American nation. Of course, she's a representative of the House of the Representatives, and it's a symbol of freedom. And we know that China is not the symbol of really freedom, in fact. But I think that it makes interferences because the status of Taiwan is not clear, according to UN and also other countries. And of course, Taiwan has become a US protectorate from years from now. And inside the Mrs. Pelosi delegation, you have Lloyd Austin, the head of Secretary of Defense. So that's why China is becoming nervous. And of course, Taiwan is a very difficult subject inside international relations between, of course, China and the USA and the other countries too.
Coming back to you, Mr. Simons, why China is considering this visit as an interference in their sovereignty?
Well, if we go back, there have been different situations where the US, especially the first time in the wake of the Second World War, called for the return of all Japanese occupied territories to China. And this included Taiwan, or as its former name, Formosa, was part of that, and it was specifically named. And we can talk about this one China policy that was formulated by the United States. So this is seen as being part of China's internal policy rather than foreign policy. And of course, the US went along with this for some time until recently, when it has been trying to contain and counter China's rise within this multipolar order.
Understood. Now, moving on to discuss another point. China could attempt to bring about the reunification by non-military means, such as strengthening economic ties. But in any military confrontation, China's armed forces would dwarf those of Taiwan. China spends more than any country except the US on defense and could draw on a huge range of capabilities from naval power to missile technology, aircraft, and cyber attacks. Much of China's military power is focused elsewhere, but in overall terms of active duty personnel, for example, there is a huge imbalance between the two sides. Staying with you, Mr. Simons, as a direct question, don't you think now we are living the same story as that one of Russia-Ukraine before Putin started his operation? I mean, China has warned several times the United States to keep its democratic lies, as they claimed, away of the Taiwan island. But US insisted to keep going on, using the same policy of provoking the other side. So what US is trying to do? Why they are pushing China to the limits as they have done with Russia?
Well, it seems to be a rather stupid game to play, especially considering how the Ukraine situation has turned out. And they, as you mentioned, basically it's a carbon copy of what they've tried with China, what they tried with Russia. And it just does not make sense. It's a strategy which will cost them, because, I mean, when you're a declining power and you're creating problems and conflicts in different parts of the world, then, I mean, they're already overstretched. And we've seen that they could not handle Afghanistan, and yet they're seemingly trying to provoke war with Russia and China simultaneously.
Really quite important to be discussed. Mr. Bachelet, what is the relation that's gathered China and Taiwan, and why China is considering Taiwan part of its territory, though this latter is totally considered for the other world as a country with its own government and its own rules?
Yes, in fact, Taiwan is a very strange subject with China. In fact, Chinese consider that Taiwan has been always a part of China. It's only a question of history, after 1949, and that's why the question is very difficult to answer. But today we know that Taiwan is seeking for new partnerships, and it symbolizes a kind of freedom like it was in Hong Kong before. But today, that the emission of the American forces on the USA in the area is, of course, maintained by the idea of trying to contain China's influence. So that's why when we are talking about Taiwan, the Americans are also testing the new alliance they have done, like AUKUS, and of course, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So that's why China is becoming nervous due to the American emission in this particular part of history of this country.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Mr. Simons, out of the questions list, now Sweden just recently has joined the bloc of the NATO. So based on this idea, as Putin claimed, NATO, or US as he claimed, they are trying to serve the world as the interest for the US. I mean, they are trying to create a head front against the rivals, China in Asia, as well as Russia in Europe. So to this point, why the European countries, I mean the Western countries in Europe, they are trying to make US taking the lead? Why they don't have a word to compare with that?
Well, it's a very stupid policy. I mean, they haven't got into NATO yet, along with Finland, because it still requires ratification. And of course, Turkey has made it clear they will not ratify unless certain demands are met, which, quite frankly, Sweden or Finland cannot really do so if they pretend to be a democracy. But yeah, it's a stupid policy because it's counterproductive. I mean, NATO has been a foreign policy tool of the US for some time. We just look at Afghanistan, what's happening in Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and other countries with these different regime changes and the disasters which it has brought. And I mean, the US has made it clear that, for example, it's going to use Ukraine as a traditional war against Russia to contain it. And countries are signing on for that. It's against their national interest and absolutely corrosive to their security.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good point you have raised. Mr. Bushley, do you really agree with what Mr. Simons has just stated? It's really stupid policy that is being taken, and it serves the interest of one country over a huge other countries. I mean, now, do you think that US is only thinking about its own interest?
I think, yes. If we look back to the NATO history, and I can talk about this topic very well because I was a part of NATO staff a long time ago. And we know that NATO is a kind of a subsidiary of UN armed forces. That was the deal when the East Bloc and the Warsaw Bloc get down. And today, the problem of Europeans is they are unable to have their own defense policy. I'm talking about Germany and France, which have a very important competition between this leadership, of course, including UK, which is also a part of Europe. I'm talking about that very clearly, of course. But the big mess of European is that they don't have a defense policy, a real defense policy. And of course, the country who has the opportunity of that is the USA. Even if the former president, I'm talking about Donald Trump, I'm talking about Barack Obama, and of course, George Bush, and they say, please, European, take in charge your own defense policy. It's time to wake up. We saw the result in 1995, for example, with the Dayton Agreement concerning Bosnia-Herzegovina. European countries were unable to have their own position about this war in Europe. And we can see the same result with Ukraine today.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Another point to be discussed: in an apparent reprisal to Pelosi's landing on Taiwan, Beijing has suspended some trade with Taipei. China has also launched military exercises near the strait and amounted to a blockade of its sea and airspace. The first Chinese reactions over pushed Taipei to start negotiations with Japan and Philippines to find alternative aviation routes. Mr. Simons, now China's first move toward this visit of Nancy Pelosi to the island is to launch a military drill of a Taiwanese border. So, can we consider this reaction as a sign of an imminent indirect war between US and China within this island?
Not necessarily. It's going to depend on what happens next, because as we saw with the Ukrainian war, this did happen. But what this is intended as in this particular instance at this stage, it's military diplomacy. So it's applying some hard pressure on Taiwan to reconsider its part. And this is a form of negotiation process.
Mm-hmm. Quite understood. As you have already mentioned, the stupid policy, don't you think it's really awkward that US now is trying to create another war while they are still having problems and another war in Europe? I mean, instead of bringing China to their side, they are trying to create another war and pushing China to join Russia.
I think it's a sign of desperation. They are a declining power. And I mean, if we look at the so-called leadership of the US, it's in complete disarray. You've got a very dysfunctional leadership, which gives no clear signals. And I mean, this is just lurching from one crisis to the next, whether it is Ukraine, whether it's COVID, and currently concerning China-Taiwan. So I think this is also an indication that when an empire declines, it declines internally to begin with. And this can be seen in the, if we put it diplomatically, the intellectual capacity of the leadership to understand the world and react appropriately to the changes in the international system.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Coming to you, Mr. Pichley, why USA that depicted itself the country of freedom and democracy always has stepped in the worst conflict, either directly or indirectly? What is the aim and the main goal US agenda is seeking to achieve?
Yes, in fact, the goal of the US concerning international relations is to create an enemy, in fact, just to make its war industry working, you know. That is a big challenge for the USA because at the moment, if we look back to the history concerning I can say the recent history with the withdrawing of Afghanistan last year at the same period, we can say that US is losing influence in Pacific area against China. And it's a two different strategy. You have the poker strategy and the go game strategy, or otherwise the pearl necklace strategy done by Beijing, of course. But today, the main challenge for America is to keep its alliance working, because we know that without the help of Japan, South Korea, and Australia, they will be unable to contain China's influence and, of course, military power in the area. But of course, we know that China and USA, they have to face with the same problems. I'm talking about terrorism, I'm talking about Afghanistan, I'm talking about other places. And of course, we have to integrate inside the equation the role played by India and, of course, Russia too.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Now, let's discuss another point. More than 5,000 soldiers from USA, Indonesia, Australia, Japan, and Singapore participated in this year's military exercise in the western Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Rio Islands. Since the drills beginning in 2009, the joint military exercises have been held at a very big scale. Despite the fact that drills would be far larger than prior ones, Washington said they were not directed at any one nation.
With all of the technical and procedural aspects of this, it's just a really important expression of our teamwork and our interoperability and our unity, really, as a group of nations that seek to continue to have a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Coming back to you, Mr. Simons, I want you to be honest with me answering this question. Don't you think now USA, the world leaders, as they claim, are leading the world to another world war? In Europe, they have recreated the Eastern-Western bloc again, that has disappeared after the Cold War, only to stop the growing influence of the main rival Russia. And now, in Asia, they are trying to create another bloc against the giant China, represented in Japan, Indonesia, Taiwan, South Korea. What are you saying about this?
No, I absolutely agree. I think what they're trying to do is resurrect these strategic imperatives that were Brzezinski formulated in the grand chessboard. And what they're doing is they're going about this in two ways. One, trying to build their own alliances or rebuild their alliances because they're rather tattered. And secondly, to wedge and to break up different alliances that oppose them. I do think this is going to be unsuccessful because, I mean, if we look at it, the US has been at continuous war for over 2 decades, and their armed forces are in disarray. And if we're talking about it, I mean, the focus of their armed forces is on sheer numbers, the tangible aspects of military power. But what they ignore is the intangible aspects of military power. So that is the psychological and cognitive factors. They're tired of war, not only the military themselves, but the people, the population. And I mean, they don't trust their military or political leadership, and the will to fight is not there. And if we look at it, I mean, this Western bloc is a very small part of the world, especially when we look at what's called the global south, the non-Western powers. And you can see this in terms of how the different powers stand in relation to the Ukraine question. Even countries like India, which have historical problems with China, are not taking the US side because they don't want to be turned into the next Ukraine in an attritional war against China. So you've got much more assertiveness in the independence of these non-Western centric countries.
Thank you ever so much for this explanation. Mr. Bushley, why no one can point finger toward USA as the war creator wherever they put step in? Why they are fighting the huge development of their competitors, such as Russia and China, with creating wars against them? Is this the only way to be used to win against the rival?
Yes, in fact, I think that today's big challenge for USA is to have a strong contradictor like China and Russia too. It's very important to underline this point, this aspect to the viewers today. I think that today America is seeking for a new leadership because from a few years it has been contested by the withdrawing of, I talk about Afghanistan and other countries where they have been weakened in, for example, in Middle East too. So today the American leadership is contested by other countries. And we can say, of course, this kind of block. And what we can see with this Indonesia drill is only to test the military procedures and maybe to have behind these military procedures new weapon market for the USA. That's why USA is trying to maintain its leadership in Pacific area. And of course, Pacific area is a key region for the USA because it has become, since World War II, an important influence area for Washington. And today, since 1949, with the arrival of the Republic of China, they have a competitor, a very strong competitor. I am talking not about military competitor, but also an competitor in economics. And this is maybe on this new subject has weakened America today.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Now, last topic to be discussed. Top Southeast Asian diplomats met in Cambodia's capital on Wednesday to intensify efforts to stop the escalating violence in Myanmar. Cambodian Prime Minister said that there had been some progress, including in providing humanitarian aid to this Asian continent. And one of the most important topics to be discussed is the Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, first by any high-ranking U.S. official indicates.
It is a desire to prove to everyone their impunity and to exercise permissiveness. I do what I want, something like that. I see no other reason to create such an annoyance, almost out of the blue, knowing very well what it means for the People's Republic of China.
Mr. Simons, it's clearly seen now that U.S. Western sanctions has failed to stop Russia from achieving its goals. And now they are trying to do the same thing against China. Don't you think they are directly and indirectly pushing China and Russia to create a strong alliance and cooperation in all fields? And will Russia step into to help with China over this island matter?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, they're doing everything which the Americans in the 1960s and 70s terrified them. They thought that an alliance between the Soviet Union and China was something to avoid at all costs. Hence, you had the diplomatic opening up. But now, I mean, the situation is that, yes, I mean, why would either China or Russia ever trust the US again? They continually break the word and their different agreements they make. So, I mean, you've actually had something which was a pragmatic partnership become much deeper now, where, I mean, there is no military support. I mean, Russia and China have their mutual military exercises, but, I mean, you've got stronger economic relations and diplomatic relations because I don't think Russia needs to help China in the event that another war is provoked by the United States over Taiwan. I mean, China has an overwhelming military advantage. Plus, I mean, these ideas of US supercarrier groups, supercarriers are the battleships of the Second World War. I mean, you've got hypersonic missiles and things like this. So I don't think there's any need for military help, but political help and diplomatic help definitely, or support.
Mm-hmm. Quite understood. Mr. Pushley, what is your reading to Lavrov's visit to Myanmar? On one side, he is saying that we have a word to say in this continent, and on the other side, he is saying and showing that Russia is standing with the giant China and the growing countries in the region against U.S. interference. Isn't that right?
Yes, it's right, but also we have to say that Myanmar is at the gate of India. And we know that there is a big problem with the Rohingya minority in Myanmar, who is threatened directly by the regime, and they are trying to escape in India. So that's why, but the visit of Mr. Lavrov is also to show that the Russian diplomacy is working, even if we have strong problems in Europe. I can say that, of course, Mr. Lavrov is Mr. Putin representative and top representative, but also it underlines that the commitment of Russia in the area is not new. It has always stayed, and it's not a competitor of China, but just a kind of a new, not a new alliance, but just to justify that, okay, we stay in the race even if we have troubles in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Mr. Simons from Sweden, thank you ever so much for taking part in our discussion. Mr. Manuel Bushri as well, thank you ever so much for your thorough analysis. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here with us on L24 News. Take care and have a blessed day.